Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to week 2 of our class. I hope you had a nice week and a great weekend with this beautiful weather, and that you had some time to look at those videos, the video that I showed last week again, to give you a little overview of what we'll be starting today. Okay? Week 2 is going to be concerning Indigenous Native American art, including Eskimo art. Indigenous means native people who lived here in the United States. They are also known as Native Americans, okay? They were the inhabitants. Inhabitants is a word that we have for vocabulary this week. They are the people who were living there. They inhabited the area. The Eskimos, as you know, live up for us in the United States in Alaska, but they also live in Canada. We know lots of things about Alaskans. Sometimes we see that they've lived in an igloo or they travel by dog sled because the weather is very cold and the conditions are very hard. But they're also known for their artwork. And one type of artwork that we're going to talk about today would be the totem poles, okay? So a totem pole is a pole made out of wood, and they usually used cedar, that had pictures on it, totems. The pictures would talk about daily life. The pictures could talk about religious beliefs, or it may even tell a story. So we'll hear about that. There's also things during this period of time and throughout our history, but we're going to start talking about arts and crafts. What are arts and crafts? Those are the crafts that people made for decoration, for artwork, for toys for children. Remember, we're dealing with people who live in a very cold area. For the Eskimo, they have lots of nighttime on their hands, so they would use that. For Indigenous people, we would talk about arts and crafts, meaning perhaps they would do a decorative bowl with painting, or they'd do a beautiful weaving or some pretty beadwork. So crafts that they're doing that way. You're going to hear me talk about, and also in the videos that we're going to see today, you're going to hear about cultural values, all right? The values that each culture has, who they believe in, who they worship, what they think is important, how they feel about their elders, that sort of thing, okay? So, Native American art. So we're going to see a visual about that after this first part of my lecture, but I'd like to talk about how Native Americans really didn't let art become an intricate part of their lives, but they did recognize great work. They recognized great beadwork versus poor beadwork, or great weaving of a basket as opposed to poor weaving of a basket, or pottery. They could see the differences. And you need to remember that this art was really based on what was available to the artist. For instance, if the artist, the Native American artist, lived in an area where there are a lot of grasses and reeds, those artisans would take the grass or the reeds, cut them and dry them, and they would weave them into baskets. They could put their corn in it. They could carry things in it. They would also do things like special headdresses, or parts of their clothing would be done with this weaving, with these grasses. Sometimes it's called raffia. In areas where there was a lot of clay in the soil, those Native American artisans would use clay to make pots to cook in, and vessels to carry water in, and plates to eat out of. So it depended on what the area was like, okay, depending on what they would be using to make the objects that they needed, okay? The main reason or role of the Indian artist was to make people feel emotion, okay? So if they made an elaborate headdress of feathers and woven reeds. It was elaborate to call attention to that person, to show that that person was important. If the artist did intricate beadwork on a belt or the top of a collar on some deer skin, this too was to call attention to the person and what they were doing. So again, Native American art comes from what's around the artist, the materials that they use, and also the forms that they see. Much of the art is geometric, meaning shapes like triangles, lines, rectangles. There'll be circles, geometric shapes, okay, and line patterns. You will also see that in some of the art, certain forms are repeated. They're repeated because they're protective art. They use certain forms that they believe will bring a good spirit into their living environment. Those forms are put here and there and shown on different places because they want the good spirits to be there. So some of this art comes from what they call visions. Some artists will do things like you might have heard about Native Americans smoking a pipe with some sort of herb in it. Well, yeah, they did. Okay. And then when they were finished smoking, not just tobacco, but whatever kind of things that they had at that time, in that state of euphoria, in that altered state, they may see visions. And those artists later take the visions that they had in their head, okay, and use that for their artwork. And for those of you who took the literature class last semester, if you remember, I told you about the author Edgar Allan Poe. Remember, he did The Raven? And I told you that Edgar Allan Poe was known for using a lot of narcotics. And some of his best work was actually written under the influence of the narcotics. He saw things differently. Well, many of these artists also reached out to use this altered state to get these visions to create their art. So we'll find things that are needed in the home as art. We're going to see things like women needing cooking bowls or bowls to grind their corn. We're going to see things where women needed a papoose or a sack for their back to carry their baby. We'll see things that are being made for the hunters to go out and use, and amulets or like necklaces, okay, to wear to protect them from evil spirits. But you could also find for the men art in the weapons they use. Now let's think about that. Remember, I just said that some of the symbols of this art were protective. Well, in some of the weapons, maybe a spear or an arrow, you could have two types of artwork on it. One, a symbol, a sign showing that this arrow should protect the hunter, but also some kind of symbolization that says, fly straight arrow, hit its mark, and, kill a deer so that my family can eat. So that's how they would use art on their weaponry. There was also a lot of artwork, as I said, used for religion and ceremonies. And those things were pretty fancy, and the more important people used them. We saw elaborate beading on clothing, on headdresses. We see the use of feathers. The more feathers, the bigger the headdress, the more important. We see bowls decorated with designs. The more affluent family, the one who might be the chief's wife or wives, would have nicer things than others, okay? Much of the art was designed to please the gods. The Native Americans wanted to do artwork that they could have and keep the gods happy. Remember, they wanted protection and to fight away the evil spirits. They believed in evil spirits. So if you could create artwork with certain symbols on it, that would work to scare the evil spirits. And I can give you an example of things that happened more recently. When Halloween began to be celebrated, people used to have scary things like scary jack-o'-lanterns and scary things to keep the evil spirits away, because Halloween was celebrated All Hallows Eve, when the spirits were supposed to be about. So that people created art to keep those spirits away. The Native Americans created art to keep the gods happy and to keep the bad spirits away. The main aim for American Indian artists was not to record history, but to create a magical design. And again, the magical design can come from their own mind, may also come from nature, which it can very easily. There are designs with curvy lines indicating water, jagged peaks indicating mountains, depending on where they live. Also, again, geometric shapes, okay? But they would also, again, look and see about drawing more stylized, more formal things, especially for religious art. So the artists did not want to show pictures of people and objects. They wanted to show what was in the person, the essence. For instance, if you wanted to show someone was kind, perhaps you and I might draw a heart to represent that person. If we wanted to show a person was mean or angry, we would use something maybe with jagged lines or something that was broken, all right? So their art would use different symbols to show the essence of the people and also the essence, the being, the spirit, the way the tribe lived, okay? So there was a whole process that they would do for their creative process. There was a tribe in New York called the Iroquois. The Iroquois Indian lived in longhouses upstate in New York, okay? And they made masks that were called false face masks. These masks had to be carved out of wood, and they did it from a trunk of a tree. And they thought that they needed this mask to come from something that was living, because the essence of the living tree would become a part of the person who wore the mask. Now, they could wear the mask during ceremonies or in healing practices, such as if someone was very sick, the shaman might come, sing, dance, wear the mask. The mask would be a type of artwork to ward off the evil spirits that were making the person sick. Okay, not all Native American art was religious or just to appease the gods. It was also practical, as I said, for everyday use. So if you think, as I said, people used what they had, you will understand why art is different. The Pueblos, for instance, did a lot of weaving, okay, because there were a lot of grasses. The Iroquois, who were upstate, had a lot of trees and a lot of branches, so they could bend the sticks, the twigs, and make things out of that. A lot of trees and whatever went into building on the longhouse. So they all take what they have at hand to make the art and to make the everyday things that they needed. So as I said earlier, if there was a lot of clay, those tribes became skillful potters, pottery makers, making bowls, vessels to carry things in, even spoons, all right, pots to cook in, all right, because clay was available. Those, again, as I said, who lived in the grasslands became great weavers, You could still carry your grain in these baskets. You could store your food in baskets. They would go down to the river or to the ocean and catch fish and put them in the basket, right? As I mentioned, they'll also incorporate that in masks and also in their clothing style. So you can see that the area in which the artists lived in was responsible for the materials that they used. That is not to say that trading didn't go on. It did. There was always trading, and Native Americans would travel, do a migration during different parts of the season for hunting because of the weather. And they might come across other people and trade things with that. They also were able to find jade and turquoise. They used a lot of shells. Shells were very important. They were very worthwhile to Native Americans, and Native Americans would trade them back and forth. A shiny big shell might be worth more than a dull little shell. They would make holes in them. They'd string them. It was even money for times, okay? And then they would use things like the quills from a porcupine. Porcupine quills were woven into baskets. If they had those animals near them, they would use the quills from the porcupine and eat the porcupine for dinner, okay? And then they would use things like tree bark, especially white birch that they could cut off and soak and make it flat. So they were very creative. They used natural things. There were no factories. Things weren't made. There weren't any stores. They had to use what they had on hand. So this ability to adapt to natural forms made some very pleasing and very eye-catching artifacts. And as I said, depending on where the Native Americans lived, where they inhabited, okay, where they lived, depended on what they made, right? But all were using forms from nature, all were using shapes for ideas from nature, and all were using materials from nature. Okay, so everything came from nature. So remember, Native American art served many purposes. One, it was a way that they used art and their drawings and their depictions to celebrate their religious beliefs. Okay, so Native American art was used for religious belief. Number two, okay, their art was also used for everyday purposes. We know that, okay? For the bowls, for the carrying of baskets to carry a child or carry food or fish or something in. Their art was used for everyday purposes. And it was also cultural. They would use their art to show who they were, the essences, what's inside of a person, strong, brave, all right? That would be very important to put on a warrior's clothing or on his quiver that held his arrows, or maybe when weaving a blanket. You would want, if you were a warrior, if you were going out or a great hunter, you would want the symbols on your clothing or your horse's blanket, or on a blanket you might use inside of your living area to show who you were. So clay work and cooking vessels were really important. Clothing was adorned with fringe and beads and porcupine quills and shells and also hair, animal hair. All right, remember, you either wove some sort of clothing or you use the skin of an animal. Okay, so you would catch the bear and you would butcher it up and you would use the meat, and perhaps you would carve the bones into an arrow or a spear, okay? Or you might, again, use them to adorn clothing. You would see teeth and claws from a bear hanging from the clothing of a Native American. That was how they used it as decorations. So hair, skin, stones, shells, and semi-precious things like jade and turquoise. So when we think about this, art for the Native American surrounded him every day. And actually, that's not that different than what we see today. We wear jewelry, right? That's a type of artwork. We wear clothing. There's patterns on it. It's a type of artwork. We live in a home where an architect designed it. So that is a three-dimensional piece of artwork. We plant flowers and bushes and trees outside our home to make it look pretty. That's artwork. So we're letting all of our artwork surround us as well. And truly, just like the Native Americans, the things that we choose say a little bit about us as well. Okay. So many times, excuse me, a group would produce a style and then it could be copied by other Native Americans through the country. I'm so sorry. And that's when we would see a mixing of patterns in the pottery or a mixing of patterns in the paintings. All right. That would be, really shown an awful lot. For coloring, what did Native Americans use to make their pigments? Remember, they couldn't go to the store and they didn't want everything to be one color, bright, because remember, Native American art is done to draw attention, right? So if everything's just beige and brown, it doesn't call a lot of attention, right? But if we can get some yellows in there, we can get some reds or rusts or oranges, or maybe a green, that would make it look really great. So they would use primitive dyes that would come from leaves, for instance, that would come from soaking different barks in hot water. You can get like a pale yellow if you use a willow bark. Sometimes on the trees, you would see like a fungus growing called lichens. If you shave that off and you would put it in a pot with really hot water, it will release a dye and you'll get sort of a purplish color for that. They would do things like if they were growing onions, they would take the skins. The skins would also be used to help flavor a broth, but you could also use some of that color, the pigment that comes from that, to make a brown or a rusty color. So everything was used from nature, okay, so that the materials and the pictures and the coloring were all done to show where they lived and to show the essence of the person that's inside of them. Now we're going to go to my first video. The first video is going to show you a little bit short about Native American art. So just hold on for a minute and I'll pull that up. It's short.
pause.
Okay.
One more time. Yes.
Okay, so you saw the beadwork that was being done. You saw them tell you that people who were more prominent, more important, had more elaborate clothing. They also said the same thing that I was talking about. There were symbols on there talking about their tribe. And they also talked about the trade and how important it was that if a tribe was strong enough and capable enough, they could travel far distances to get different materials to use for their clothing or for their artwork, their beading and that sort of thing. So that's very important to look at. Now, we didn't look very much at vessels, eating vessels, because I'm sure you've seen a lot of that. But again, made of clay in areas where there was a lot of clay prevalent and used for everyday things, so they could carry water, so they could eat, that sort of thing. And also, you know, to help wash up and bathe, they'd go down to the river and put water in and pour it over their head, you know, just like we do things like that. So Native Americans would use nature, would use natural things for coloring, would use available materials, and would use signs that they would have to depict what kind of tribe they were. Now, the next part is about Eskimos. And as I said, Eskimos are native people in areas like Canada, up north in Canada, and also in the United States, in Alaska. They live in very, very harsh climates. So they too, even to this day, rely on what nature is providing for them so that they can survive. They eat fish that they catch all summer, and they dry it and they salt it so they can have that. In addition, they catch animals and use the skins to help make their coats and their boots. All right. They use the fat from fish to rub it on to waterproof their clothing. Just like the Native Americans, they rely on nature to provide their inspiration for their artwork and also to show who they are, and also at times show their religious thoughts and also show the inner essence of a person. Okay, so in the Pacific Northwest, totem poles were made, and they are a record. It's sort of like writing things down, but it's in a long, tall column. As I mentioned earlier, most totem poles are made out of cedar. Cedar is a very hard wood, and so carving it is not that easy. But if you use a hardwood to begin with, the totem pole will last for a long time. Plus, cedar is a type of wood that resists insects. It would be really not so great, right? That you spent a whole year carving this totem pole made out of pine, and you get it painted and you get it up and whatever, and termites come or ants decide to come and burrow their way into your totem pole and ruin it. So they used cedar, which was very hard and also insect resistant. And totem poles were passed on from one generation to another. They were very important. They showed a religious aspect of the relationship of the tribe or the person with the creator, with God, all right? And they were created by 5 nations in the Pacific Northwest, okay? Pacific Northwest, up maybe in, like I said, in that area of Canada. You can also see them in areas of state of Washington and then also going up into Alaska. Okay. The totem pole monuments created by the 5 nations of the Pacific Northwest represented ancestry, history of people, events that have been taken. And again, they chose cedar, which was indigenous, native to where they lived because of its strength. Totem poles would be between 3 and 10 feet in height. Okay, so it would take quite a long time to carve a totem pole that was 10 feet in height because you're doing it with hand tools. There's no power tools. And even today, when people are making totem poles, they are trying, okay, to use the same techniques and the same skills that artisans from the past used. Okay. So the totem poles that people see display animals, okay, different kinds of animals. Then they show a family history, right? Totem poles tell a story in a very in-your-face, prominent way. I mean, it could be 10 feet tall and this wide with big faces and carvings of animals. And they're usually painted as well. Again, how do these artisans get paint for their totem poles? They use things like clay and mud and herbs and branches and bark, which they boil down or they grind up to make pigment. What's pigment? Pigment is the material that makes the paint. So not only is it hard, okay? Not only is it hard to carve this totem pole and cut down the tree, then you have to make the pigment as well, and then you have to start painting it. And each color means something. It's used not because, wow, that color looks good next to another. There's significance in each one. And totem poles are very well recognized and are used in many ceremonies. Now, I was just recently upstate, up in the Adirondacks, and I went to an outdoor show, an outdoor fair, where people come from all over the country. And there was a man who was actually selling, maybe a 3-foot totem pole and maybe a 6-foot totem pole. They were really pretty interesting. And I talked to him, and he had gotten them from actually, not from Alaska, but from Canada, but from that area. And why would someone want to buy that? Well, because it's interesting art, or maybe you'd have a restaurant, you think it would look good outside and that sort of thing. So on a totem pole, you'll find human and animal forms. And frontal poles are located at the front of a building. For instance, at your front door, at the front of a longhouse, at the front of any important building that is in your complex that you're living in, all right? Those are frontal poles. So what do you think a frontal pole would be used for? I think that you probably know that because some of the symbols are there to scare off evil spirits, for Native American art, the same is true with totem poles. They want people who are passing into their home or into a building to be good people, to be pure, not to carry evil spirits with them. So some of the decorations on the totem pole will be there to prevent evil spirits from entering the home. The second thing is, it's also a way to say, sometimes outside of your house, you have a sign and it says, the Smith family lives here, okay? That's telling who lives there. Instead of writing the name of the family, they might put a symbol that if you went to that house, you'd say, oh, I know, so-and-so lives here. So the frontal pole could also be a marker showing who lives or what families or what tribe lives in this house. Okay, so that's what a frontal pole would be. They didn't just carve them and paint them. There were also poles made for people who had died to pay honor to them. So on those, there might be some hair from the person incorporated or drilled in and attached, or maybe some teeth, something like that. Um, and this way, that would be a way to say this pole is a way to recognize this person who lived. And in a way, it works sort of like when you go to the cemetery and you see a gravestone. The gravestone is a marker talking about or saying so and so is buried here. All right. So they put things from the person who died, the deceased person, into the totem pole. People didn't realize the importance or didn't realize the beauty of totem poles till the 1800s, the 19th century. And one of the reasons for that was they were somewhat isolated in their location, Pacific Northwest. But as people began to travel further and further across the United States, and finally getting into Canada with Northwest expansion, and then going up into Alaska, which wasn't part of the United States at that time, and coming down along the coast for where California is, they began to experience this art. And it's quite breathtaking. And there's some areas where there's so many totem poles standing next to each other, looks a little like a totem pole forest. So that must be very, very beautiful. Now, of course, many artisans will be using the older tools that were used, but we've made better steel. They're not carving with a whalebone. So totem poles can become more elaborate, more fancy. So let's recap about totem poles. Totem poles are made in the Pacific Northwest. The Pacific Northwest includes Canada. It's going to include parts of the state of Washington, maybe Oregon, definitely Alaska, okay? Totem poles are made from cedar. Cedar is a very hard wood, and it's insect resistant, and it weathers well. So when you use this cedar for your totem pole, it's guaranteed to last for a while, right? Totem poles have pictures of animals and people and symbols of groups or tribes. They were hand carved originally. Now, many people still use old type tools, but others will use modern tools, which will allow the carving to become more elaborate, more fancy. Totem poles are painted and decorated, just like the Native Americans did, by using clay, plant materials, bark, ashes that are combined to make pigments, which are also known as paints, okay? People did not realize the beauty and the importance of totem poles until the 1800s, because the area where people were producing totem poles was isolated and there was not that much travel at the time, okay? Totem poles can be used to commemorate or celebrate the life of a deceased person. Any totem pole that is used to do that will probably include something from the person. One of the most prominent things we see is hair, also teeth, right? They're embedded in the totem pole. It's a respectful thing to do. This person died, we're honoring his memory. There are things called frontal totem poles. especially if you had a longhouse or any kind of home and you put this totem pole in the front, it would tell the visitor who or what type of tribe was living in this home, and would also include symbols that would ward off or frighten any evil spirits so that they did not enter into the house. Men mainly made totem poles, but women became skilled carvers later as well. It was hard work, and women were always involved in making the food, preparing the clothes, taking care of the kids. So it was not as easy a time to be making some totem pole, right? But they did acquire skills. And if you look today, those skills have been handed down to many women who continue this art. And they do continue using the same sort of symbols, the same sort of material. And let me tell you how you go about making a totem pole. Number one, remember, you go out into the forest to cut down a tree. Not just any tree. You have to go into a cedar forest because you want that strong insect repellent wood. So you cut down the tree. Next, you have to scrape off the bark of the tree, right? Because you want to get to that smooth wood underneath. Scrape off the bark, okay? And you could do it with chisels and bone if you had to, but they also used saws later on and that sort of thing. You want to take the tree and make it smooth without any bark. So you have a plain canvas, a plain surface to work on. Number three is to look at the grain of the wood. You know what grain of the wood is. It's when you look at it and you see it goes up like this, and maybe there's a knot, it comes down. You have to look at the grain of the wood because if you're trying to carve in certain areas, it will be harder than others. Wider spaces between the grain are softer and easier to carve. Sometimes you want that grain to fill in the pattern. Now, I know this is a strange thing, but some of you are parents, so you might know this. If you ever saw Pocahontas, the Disney movie, the tree is the grandmother, and it comes alive and her face talks and she's the tree. And if you look, the grain of the wood makes her look like she has lots of wrinkles and characteristics in the face. So when they were making the totem poles, they too looked at the grain to enhance or make better the look of the totem pole. Number four, after the wood is carved, there's some paint in. Not the whole thing, it doesn't have to be painted. You might use some here or there, or embellishments would be added. Embellishments might be, as I said, the hair, or maybe some kind of stones that they wanted to put into it. And they became a very, very important part to tell the story of indigenous people who lived in the Pacific Northwest. They have a social cultural role for the First Nations. What does that mean? Social, okay? Society, cultural, how their society operated. Those totem poles told stories from the past up into the present. So it was sort of like a writing of their history. Remember, people didn't always have books. So in order to talk about their beliefs and their history or the history of people, they would put this information into their totem poles. So some totem poles would be used to celebrate the life of a chief or someone who was famous. And some weren't. Some were just used in front of the homes of Pacific Northwest people who wanted to make sure that you knew who they were. In any case, right now I have a video that I would like you to look at, and you will see a little bit about totem poles. I will finish with the video and won't come back, but I want you to review these videos this week until we move into our next class. All right, and next week, I should have our lesson up on Monday, and we're going to start talking about the 1800s already. And we're going to start talking about the art of the Hudson River School. And this is another school of painting of artists that depend on using the natural world around them to create their artwork. So that ties in very nicely, okay, with indigenous people. And as we're moving further, okay, and remember I said that totem poles were really discovered later on. They weren't made only in the 1800s, but around the 1800s, we're going to take that jumping off point to start our discussion next week. Okay, and also we're going to talk about romantics and romanticism in art, naturalism, which we talked about a little bit today. You do not have any homework other than you must make sure that each week you are logging into all 4 classes. The teacher for the American history class has been a little delayed. So you have to keep watching to see when he posts his lesson, and then you'll have to catch up. Teacher, Professor Marilyn McNeil and Professor McBride have already posted and will be posting again this week. If you are having any difficulty, as I said last week, viewing or getting on with your NIAC account, please call Jake at the school. Don't just sit there and wait. You need to participate in these classes. And they're all designed to be somewhat fun, but also very knowledgeable of different areas about life in the United States. So with that, I'm going to stop for 1 second and then pull up the video that talks about totem poles. Have a really great week, and I'll see you next week. Where do I start? We're done.
Mhm.
That's it.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yes.
2 down.